My best friend Mason texted me at 2 in the morning asking if I was awake, and the dumbest part is I almost didn't answer, because I had a chemistry final in 6 hours and I'd promised myself I'd stop letting him wreck my sleep schedule every time he had a bad night with his girlfriend. But I answered. I always answered. That was kind of the whole problem if I'm being honest with you, though it took me another 4 months to admit that to myself. He didn't say what was wrong. He just asked if he could come over. I said yeah, obviously, because that's what you do when your best friend of 9 years asks to come over at 2 a.m., even if you have a final, even if you've got a headache starting behind your left eye from staring at reaction mechanisms for 6 hours straight. He showed up in sweatpants and no jacket even though it was October, and he sat on the edge of my bed instead of the beanbag chair like he usually does, and he didn't say anything for maybe 10 minutes. I let him not say anything. That's a thing you learn being friends with someone that long, when to talk and when to just exist next to them. Eventually he said Priya and I broke up. And I said all the things you're supposed to say, that I was sorry, that I knew how much he loved her, that breakups feel like the end of the world for about 3 weeks and then they don't. I actually believed most of that when I said it. I did not expect what came after. He looked at his hands for a second and then he said, it wasn't really about her. I asked what he meant because I genuinely didn't understand, and he went quiet again in that way he does when he's building up to something, like he's testing the weight of a sentence before he lets it out of his mouth. Then he said, I keep thinking about you more than I think I'm supposed to. I want to tell you I had some clever response ready. I didn't. I just sat there on my own bed in my own dorm room with my chemistry notes still glowing on my laptop screen, and I said, what does that mean? In this flat voice that didn't sound like mine. He said he didn't know exactly. He said it wasn't something he'd decided, it was something he'd noticed, the way you notice whether changing gradually and then all at once. He said he'd catch himself checking his phone for my texts before hers. He said sometimes when Priya kissed him he'd think about something I'd said that day and get distracted, and he hated himself for it because she didn't deserve that, and neither in a different way did I, because he didn't know what to do with any of it. I remember laughing, not a mean laugh. A confused one, a kind of nervous exhale because my brain didn't have a filing system for this information. Mason had had 3 girlfriends since I'd known him. Mason had a poster of a swimsuit model on his dorm wall that he thought was funny but was also unmistakably still up. Mason was the guy who once told me freshman year, completely unprompted, that he wasn't weird about gay stuff, obviously, in that specific tone straight guys use when they want credit for basic decency. I said, you're not gay, Mason. He said, I know, I don't think I am, I don't know what I am, I just know I think about you a lot and it's messing with my head. I didn't sleep that final morning. I went and took the chemistry exam running on 90 minutes of sleep and a granola bar, and I don't remember a single question on it. I remember walking out of the lecture hall and standing in the hallway for a second because my legs felt like they belonged to somebody else. Here's the thing you should probably know about me so the rest of this makes sense. I've known I was gay since I was 14. I came out at 17 to my parents first badly in a car in a Wendy's parking lot because I panicked and couldn't wait until we got home. My parents were fine about it, more fine than I expected, and by the time I got to college I wasn't hiding anything. Mason knew. Mason had known since we were 16. Mason was, in fact, the second person I ever told after my cousin, and he'd hugged me so hard he cracked something in my back and said, cool, does this mean I get to hear about your crushes now? Like it was the most normal thing in the world, which to him, it apparently was. And for 3 years after that, it had been normal. I had 2 boyfriends during college, both brief, both things Mason had opinions about, mostly unhelpful ones. He'd sit through my heartbreaks with a bag of chips like it was a sporting event. I'd sat through his relationships the same way. We were, I thought, just friends who happened to like different genders, and that fact was as unremarkable to us as the fact that he liked mustard on his sandwiches and I didn't. So when he told me at 2 in the morning that he thought about me more than he was supposed to, my first genuine feeling underneath the shock was something close to anger. Not because he'd said it, because I'd spent 3 years being careful. I'd never let myself linger too long on the fact that he was, objectively, someone I'd have found attractive if the door had been open. Because the door was closed, cleanly closed, closed by every relationship he'd ever had and every offhand joke about girls he'd ever made in front of me. I built a whole structure of feelings on top of that closed door being closed. And now he was standing there telling me it might not be. I didn't say any of that to him that night. I told him he should get some sleep, and he did, on my floor on the extra blanket, and I lay awake listening to him breathe and hatting how much I liked the sound of it. For the next 2 weeks he didn't bring it up again, and neither did I. We went back to normal, or something that looked like normal from a distance. We got dinner at the place with the bad pad thai that we loved anyway. We watched a show we'd both already seen because neither of us could agree on something new. He made fun of my handwriting. I made fun of the fact that he still hadn't learned to parallel park. It was almost enough to convince me I'd imagined the whole thing, except every so often I'd catch him looking at me a beat too long and then looking away fast like he'd been caught at something. I brought it up first in the end because the not talking about it was worse than any conversation could be. We were sitting in his car in the parking lot outside my building, engine off, that specific kind of quiet where you can hear the car cooling down. I said, "Are we going to talk about what you said?" He said, "I was hoping you'd forgotten." "I don't forget things people tell me at 2 in the morning, Mason." He laughed, but it wasn't a real laugh, it was the sound people make when they're stalling. Then he said, "I don't know what I want you to say, I don't even know what I want, I just know I've been miserable pretending I didn't say it." I asked him the obvious question. I asked if he was gay, or bi, or figuring something out, or if this was just some post-breakup thing where his brain had grabbed onto the nearest safe person because he was lonely and I happened to be convenient. He didn't like that last part. He said, "Is that what you think this is? Is that convenient?" I said I didn't know what to think because he'd handed me something enormous and then acted like everything was fine for 2 weeks, and I didn't know how to hold both of those things at once. He was quiet for a long time, then he said something I didn't expect. He said, "When Priya and I were together, I used to imagine you in the room sometimes. Not sexually at first, just I'd be having a good moment with her and part of my brain would go, I wish Eli was here to see this, or I wish Eli thought this was funny too. And then eventually it stopped being just wanting you there. It became wanting it to be you instead of her. And I didn't know what to do with that because you're my best friend and I've never once in my life thought about a guy that way before you. I want to be honest with you about how that made me feel because it wasn't simple. Part of me felt something crack open, something hopeful and terrified at the same time. And part of me felt used, like I'd been cast in somebody else's identity crisis without being asked if I wanted the part. I told him that. I told him I couldn't be his experiment. I told him that if this was just confusion, if this was just grief for his relationship wearing a different mask, I needed him to figure that out somewhere that wasn't me, because I'd already spent years being careful with my heart around him and I didn't have it in me to hand it over on a maybe. He got quiet and then he said okay, and I got out of the car and I didn't look back at him, though I wanted to, badly, the whole walk to my door. We didn't talk for 11 days after that. The longest we'd gone without talking since we were 15, and had a fight over a video game that neither of us even remembers the details of anymore. 11 days of me checking my phone and hating myself for checking it. 11 days of my roommate asking why I looked like someone had died, and me not having an answer that made sense out loud. On the 12th day he showed up at the coffee shop where I work part-time, sat at the counter during my shift, ordered a drink he didn't even like, and waited until my break to talk to me. He said he'd been thinking, really thinking, not just spiraling. He said he'd talked to his older brother about it, which surprised me because Mason doesn't talk to anyone about anything real, that's usually my job. He said his brother had asked him a question that stuck with him. Are you attracted to men in general, or are you attracted to Eli specifically? And Mason said he'd sat with that question for days and the honest answer was the second one. He said he didn't look at other guys and feel anything. He looked at me and felt something he didn't have words for yet, and he didn't know if that made him bi, or if it made him someone who'd just fallen in love with a specific person regardless of the shape people usually put around that word, and he said he was tired of needing a label before he let himself feel the thing. He said, "I'm not asking you to fix this for me, I'm not asking you to be patient while I figure out what I am. I'm telling you I know what I want even if I don't know what to call myself yet. I want you. I've wanted you for months and I was too scared to say it because I thought saying it would break something I couldn't get back." I stood there in my apron with a coffee rag still in my hand, and my manager was giving me a look from behind the register because my break was basically over, and none of that mattered because I was looking at my best friend of 9 years telling me he loved me in the middle of a coffee shop that smelled like burnt espresso, and it did not feel like a movie. It felt clumsy and terrifying and real. I told him I needed time. Not because I didn't feel anything back, I did, God I did, I'd felt it for longer than I'd ever let myself admit, maybe since sophomore year of high school if I'm being fully honest, but because I needed to know this wasn't going to be something he regretted in 3 months when the newness wore off and the fear of what people would think crept back in. I'd seen him care what people thought before. He was the guy who'd waited until junior year to tell his parents he thought weed should be legal because he didn't want to deal with the conversation. This was so much bigger than that. He said he understood. He said he'd wait as long as I needed. And then he did something that got me more than anything else he'd said. He told his roommate. Not me, not privately, but his actual roommate, a guy named Derek who Mason had known since freshman orientation, and who Mason had always been a little performatively masculine around, the way some guys are with other guys they're not fully comfortable with. He told Derek that he had feelings for his best friend and that his best friend was a guy, and Derek apparently just said okay and asked if he wanted to order pizza. And Mason told me about it like it had been the bravest thing he'd ever done, and honestly for him, it kind of was. We didn't get together right away. I want you to know that because I think stories like this always skip to the part where everything's easy, and it wasn't easy, not for a while. We had a slow, awkward, occasionally excruciating period of about 6 weeks where we were something in between friends and not friends, where a hug lasted 2 seconds too long and neither of us knew what to do about it, where he'd start to say something and stop, where I caught myself rehearsing conversations in the shower that we never actually had. The moment it actually shifted wasn't dramatic. We were at his apartment, half watching a movie neither of us was paying attention to, and his hand was just sitting there on the couch cushion between us, close enough that I could feel the heat coming off it without touching it. And I remember thinking, this is stupid, we are grown adults, and I just reached over and laced my fingers through his. He went very still. I thought I'd made a mistake. Then he turned his hand over so our palms were pressed together and said so quietly I almost missed it, "Took you long enough?" I said, "You've got to be kidding me, I was giving you time." He said, "I didn't need time, I needed you to stop being noble about it." We laughed so hard we woke up his neighbor, who banged on the wall, and that was somehow the moment it all stopped being terrifying and started being funny, and ours, and real. The first time he kissed me, he did it badly, too fast, missed a little, and we both burst out laughing again in the middle of it, foreheads knocking together, and he said, "Okay, that was not how I practiced that." And I asked if he'd actually practiced kissing a guy in a mirror, and he turned so red he couldn't answer, which was answer enough. Telling people was its own story. His parents took it about as well as you'd expect from people who'd spent 20 years building a very specific picture of who their son was going to marry. Which is to say, not great at first, a lot of careful silences at Thanksgiving, his mom asking me if I wanted more mashed potatoes in a voice that was trying too hard to sound normal. But 6 months later she texted him a photo of a couple at a wedding she was attending and said, "You and Eli should do something like this someday." And Mason showed me that text like he'd just won something. My parents already knew about me, obviously, but meeting Mason as my boyfriend instead of my best friend was its own strange adjustment for them too, mostly because they'd known him for 9 years as that boy Eli's known forever, and had to recalibrate what that meant. My dad, in classic form, just shook Mason's hand a little too firmly and said, "Well, it's about time someone in this house figured out what was obvious to the rest of us," which mortified both of us and also made me want to cry a little, because it meant my dad had seen something between us long before either of us had let ourselves see it. I think about that a lot actually, how many people around us had apparently clocked it before we did. Priya, of all people, texted Mason months after their breakup, no bitterness in it, just this quiet observation. "I think some part of me always knew it wasn't really about me not being enough. I just didn't have the right word for what it was about." That text broke something open in Mason for days. He cried about it, actually cried, because he'd been so afraid he'd hurt her for nothing, and instead she'd handed him a strange kind of grace. It's been a year and a half now. I'm not going to tell you it's been perfect because that would be a lie, and this whole thing only means something to you if it's true. We've had fights about stupid things, about him still occasionally referring to himself as straight in a joking way that landed wrong, about me getting insecure and asking if he missed being with women in a way that wasn't fair to ask, about the ordinary friction of two people learning how to be in love with someone they used to only be friends with, which turns out to require relearning almost everything, even the easy parts. But here's what I keep coming back to late at night, the way you do with the things that actually matter. 9 years ago, a 15-year-old kid sat next to me at lunch because the other seat was taken and he never left. Somewhere in those 9 years, without either of us noticing exactly when the thing we called friendship became the deepest, most patient kind of love there is, the kind that doesn't announce itself, that just quietly rearranges your whole life while you're busy calling it something smaller. He still doesn't have a clean label for what he is, and honestly neither of us needs him to have one anymore. Some people need the word first and the feeling comes later. He was the other way around. He felt at first, for months, silently scared out of his mind before he ever let himself name it. And when he finally did name it at 2 in the morning in sweatpants with no jacket on in October, it was the bravest thing I'd ever seen anyone do. Sometimes I think about how close I came to not answering that text. How if I just turned my phone face down and gone to sleep before my final like a responsible person, this whole thing might have stayed folded up inside him forever, one of those confessions that gets carried around for a lifetime and never spoken. I don't know what that version of my life would have looked like. I don't want to know. I just know that some nights when he's asleep next to me, breathing in that same specific way he did on my floor that first night, I think about how strange it is that the biggest change of my life started with a 2 a.m. text I almost ignored, and I find myself hopping in a quiet, superstitious way that somewhere out there, someone else is about to get a text like that too, and that they answer it.